All right, hello and welcome back. We're going to be picking up where we left off with Atsukovsky's Etherdynamics. We're on chapter 2, 2.2 to be specific. So this is disadvantages of the known hypotheses, the known hypotheses, theories, and models of ether. Despite the abundance and variety of various hypotheses, models, and theories of the ether, their authors fail to create any complete and consistent picture of the world, covering at least the basic forms of the matter and types of interaction. All these hypotheses and models are characterized by some or other fundamental shortcoming that did not allow them to development, or that did not allow them to develop. And the main reason for these shortcomings is methodological. And the main drawbacks were three. The first disadvantage was that all hypotheses, models, and theories of the ether were from the very first to the last considered a certain narrow range of phenomenon without affecting the rest. The models of uh, the models of Descartes, the models of Descartes and Newton, of course, could not take into account electromagnetic phenomenon, much less intra-atomic interactions, and the works of Faraday, Maxwell, Lorentz, and Hertz, and the other researchers did not take into account for gravitation, and did not account for the consider and did not consider the structure of matter. So when he says gravitation, by the way, so obviously they're on that mass attract mass grind for the most part. Like that's the mainstream narrative now. But the ideas of gravitation, as Newton pointed out in one of his Principias that was cited earlier, this could be a pressure mediation between the different densities of ether. And when two objects get close together that are of different densities, obviously, and then the compactness of ether between them will cause the rarefication of that will facilitate the mechanism of pressure mediation in the dense ether or the less dense ether around it, right? So there is a mechanism for it in for what they call gravitation in that etheric regard as well. So don't be deterred by the terminology and what we're looking at today. We're looking at how to explain the actual mechanisms of the phenomenon. So, say hypothetically, Cavendish does show an attraction. Say there is some sort of mass attracting mass situation like that. Well, how would you explain it, right? So, this gets into the mechanism without assuming that the matter is the cause of the attraction itself, right? So, this is how you have a framework to interpret these types of things, right? So to get that mechanical interaction without invoking magic action at a distance, you're looking at a pressure mediation. Well, what's pressure mediation? Well, different densities, interacting, right? And seeking equilibrium. So that could be quote unquote gravitation. So anyway, and it did not consider any structure of matter in their works. Stokes and Fresnel tried to explain actually the only phenomenon of aberration. So yeah, these people were only concerned with how light was moving. Um, Faraday and Maxwell and Hertz didn't take it into account gravitational effects. And let's see, what was the other one? Can't remember. These two couldn't account for electromagnetic phenomenon, so the relative motion uh, of a what is it? A conductor and a something else. I can't remember. It's what Einstein based his postulates off of, but it's basically, when you move a magnet through by a conductor, it generates an electric current, or when you move the conductor over the magnet, it generates an amplified magnetic field or something like that. Like that's the Lorentz force. So I guess these theories could account for that, and vice versa, etc. So that's what we're looking at here. Let's see. JJ, skipped ahead here. In the mechanical models, Navier, McCullen, and further V. Thompson and J. J. Thompson considered the range of electromagnetic phenomenon. However, V. Thompson and J. Thompson tried to penetrate to some extent their essence of the structure of the matter, tried to penetrate to some extent into the essence of the structure of the matter. Thus, no theory of the ether has attempted to answer either questions of the structure of matter or the basic interactions, thus disconnecting them from each other. Yeah, this is really, really good critiques. Really straightforward. Let's see here. Yeah. The second major drawback. Okay, yeah, that was the first. So we'll just was yeah. And the second major drawback of okay. And the second, sorry, I'm just going through my highlights so I can reference it later on the second read. The second major drawbacks of practicality, all theories, drawbacks of practicality, all theories and models of the ether, without exception, except the models of Newton and Lesage, is that the ether was considered a continuous medium. Therefore, most authors have treated the ether as an ideal fluid or an ideal solid. Such metaphysical idealizations for properties, the ether, admissible for physical conditions or phenomenon, extended automatically to all conceivable conditions and phenomenon to which inevitably led to contradictions. The third disadvantage of many theories was that the last ones of W. Thompson and J. Thompson and the separation of the matter of atoms and of the particle from the matter of ether, and the ether appears as an independent substance perceiving energy from particles and of matter in completely incomprehensible way and transmitting energy to particles and matter. In the works of Fresnel and Lorentz, there are actually three independent substances: matter, independent of the ether freely penetrating through the matter, and light, incomprehensibly created by matter, transmitted by matter to ether, and then again perceived by matter without any disclosure of the mechanism of all three mechanisms and transformations. Dang, that's brutal. So let's see. What did he say about further? Most authors treated the ether as an ideal fluid or ideal solid. Such metaphysical idealization of properties of the ether admissible for some physical conditions or phenomenon extended automatically to all conceivable. Oh, okay. So, so I think he's trying to say that, saying that all that linking all physical phenomenon and physical conditions leads to contradictions, inevitable contradictions. And that was part of the second critique, which was that all the exceptions was considered a continuous medium. Also idealizing the motion of it, I guess. Have to look that up later. Okay. The ether appears as okay, yeah, got to that. Sorry. Although the author of the above hypothesis models of the ether and the ether, ugh, man, although the authors of the above hypothesis, models, and theories of the ether asserted correctly the very fact of the existence of a medium, the carrier of energy, of interactions, and the basis of the structure of matter, the above drawback made it practically impossible to use these theories and their development within the framework and or of the initial assumptions. However, the main drawback of all the theories of the model of the ether was the actual postulation of its properties. This is practically nobody ever put forward any philosophical or methodological basis to determine the parameters of the ether. This is super important here. In respect to the determination of the ether parameters, had the same postulates characters the statements about its absence in nature, the physical properties of the ether were not determined from the from the known experimental data, which were obviously insufficient in those terms, but were postulated based on the taste of each author's concept. But they all agreed that the ether was in some way the ideal and absolute, such as an ideal liquid. The ether had the property of all penetration, and the mechanism of all penetration was not substantiated in any way. The idea when penetrating through a substance, the ether could flow or be slowed down due to viscosity or other reasons was never discussed. Man, so true. That's exactly why they do the modern Michelson-Morley experiments the way that they do now. So they don't do them analogously to how they were originally detected, and they make modifications to it that reduce uh, the viscosity of the ether, thus affecting its effect on it. They do the experiments in basements. They change the arm length of the apparatuses. They change the sensor location. They do all that stuff. They change the medium of the vacuum of the tubes that'll be in a vacuum, or they'll add various gases as the medium. And when you change any one of these factors and slice them up and don't analyze them in the original way, then then yeah, you're going to get interference, or you're going to get less interference patterns. And that's Dayton Miller pointed that out in 1925, 1933, and also Yuri Galev in 2002 and 2001 repeated the Michelson-Morley experiment with the waveband optics and with millimeter radio waves, and found the same exact situation, that there's a fluctuation in it, and that using certain materials can actually affect the readings. And that's something that we should definitely be putting forward, or you distinguishing against this exact point right here. This is super important. All right, the Fresnel ether was as the Lorentz ether, an absolutely stationary ether. Hertz's ether had the property of being absolutely trapped by a moving body. Oh, I think that was the entrained theory. And Maxwell's ether fluid was a perfect fluid, and Helmholtz's laws of vortices apply. I like me some Helmholtz vortices. Sorry, I'm gonna go back and copy paste this later. Ether critiques. Okay. Helmholtz's law of absolute vortices. Or not absolute, but vortices apply. Maxwell did not pay attention to the fact that, according to Helmholtz, vortices in Maxwell's equations are vortex formations of ether, and they can neither to form or disappear in an ideal fluid, which is clearly contradicted by experiment. This ideal is. I'll have to come back to this. Let's see which experiments they're talking about there. Thus, the idealization of the properties of the ether immediately dooms all such theories and contradictions to defeat. The fact that the idealizations of the ether was adopted by many authors in various concepts of the ether is methodologically understandable, since the data for some or more or less, I'm sorry, the data for more or less correct determinations of the properties of the ether did not exist at the time. Natural science had not accumulated data on the behavior of elementary particles of matter and their mutual formations. Gas dynamics had not yet been developed, however, at some point were known even then, but they were not given any importance. At all stages of development of natural science, it was possible to formulate the idea of general physical invariance. Postulating on the properties of the ether, it was possible to propose a gas medium, a model, at least on the basis of the fact that the medium should naturally fit the entire world and not provide any noticeable resistance. However, nothing of this was done, which testifies to the insufficient development of the methodological foundations of physics at practically all stages. Uh, Practically all stages of development in natural science. That's a good point. Dialectical materialism filled the gap to a certain extent, but as experience shows, it never became a working tool for all those who tried to develop theories, hypotheses, and models on the ether, and it became even even less a and less became a guide for those who indiscriminately denied and continue to deny the existence in nature, to deny its existence in nature. All right. Section 2.3, Ether Wind, Reality and Falsification. The history of the research of the ether wind, citation 92 to 93, is one of the most confusing histories in modern natural science. The significance of the ether wind research goes beyond the research of any particular physical phenomenon. The result of the first works of its direction had a decisive influence on the natural science in the 21st century, the so-called null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, Michelson-Morley, performed by these researchers in 1881 and 1887, led physicists of the 20th century to the idea not only that the absence of the ether wind on the surface of Earth, but also the conviction that the ether, the world medium filling all space, does not exist in nature. No positive result obtained by these or other researchers later years has has not years have not shaken this confidence. And when Einstein himself in the 1920s and 1920 or in 1920 and 1924 began to claim that physics is inconceivable without the ether, it did not change anything. So yeah, if you recall back, Einstein in his books in 1920 and 1924, he says the general theory of relativity is inconceivable without the ether, and obviously the angular momentum of the cosmos affects the speed of light. However, as it has been revealed now in the theory of the ether wind, due in due time, a number of scientists carried out very solid works. Some of them gave exceptional positive or rich positive material. To these, of course, we must find and all refer to the research conducted by the remarkable American scientist Professor Dayton Clarence Miller of the School of Applied Science, who spent practically his entire life on this research. And it is not his fault, but it is our misfortune that all of the results obtained by him and his group contemporaries of or in his group by contemporaries of the scientist and later theoretical physicists are categorized as quote unquote unrecognized. By 1933, when the studies of Miller and his group were completed, the school of relativists, following Einstein's special theory of relativity, stood firmly on its feet and vigilantly watched that nothing could not shake its foundations. Yeah, no non-recognition, no, I'm sorry, such quote unquote non-recognition also contributed to the results of the experiment, in which some other authors, without wishing to do so, made the mistake and did not get the desired effect. They should not be blamed for their intentionality of such outcome. They did not realize the nature of the ether, its properties, and its interaction with matter. Therefore, they made a fundamental mistake in conducting the experiment, which did not allow them to succeed. Today, the reason for these failures has become quite clear. The science, wow, man, this is speaking my language. However, the negative opinion of the so called scientific community still hangs on still hangs over the problem of the ether wind, and it is a very serious obstacle to the restorations of the ideas about of the ether and the development of work. Man, let me just start over. However, the negative opinion of the so-called quote unquote scientific community still hangs over the problem of the ether wind, and it's a serious obstacle to the restoration of the ideas about the ether and the development of of work in this extremely promising field of natural science. Today, it is necessary to critically the consider critically reconsider the whole history of the search for the ether wind, at least in order to understand the true situation in this matter, to in the future avoid the mistakes that were made by various researchers, in which the immediate rejection of further research in this direction, which led to the rejection, or doing the experiments incorrectly, giving inconsistent results, disproving it, making it seem like an unviable hypothesis, is what he's saying, to avoid doing that by understanding how to do it correctly. The origin of the ether wind and its problem of aberration in the light in astronomy, which was discovered by J. Bradley in 1728. To explain the aberration, a number of hypotheses were proposed. The most fruitful of them was from Fresnel's hypothesis of a stationary ether, put forward by him in 1825, and then used by Hendrik Lorentz in his Electrodynamics of Moving Media. James Clerk Maxwell, shortly before his death, noted in citation 94 that when the Earth moves through the ether, there must be an etheric effect on its surface, an ether wind on its surface, which accordingly would change the speed of light propagation in the ether. Unfortunately, noted Maxwell, all methods of measuring the change of time of the passage of light on a segment of path require the return of the light to go to the starting point. So the difference in the time appears to depend on the ratio of squares to the velocity of the ether wind to the speed of light. And this is a very small value, and it is practically impossible to measure. Despite this, in 1880, Albert Michelson developed a device, an interferometer, with two intersecting optical paths, with the help of which such measurement became possible. However, it turned out that the obtained result did not correspond with the expected ones, and the deviations were within the error values, citation 95. Not satisfied with the results of the 1881 experiment due to the high sensitivity of the interferometer due to the vibration interface, Michelson in 1886 and 1887 with Professor E. Morley continued the work, significantly improving the interferometer and placing it on a float immersed in a mercury bath, which got rid of the influence of vibrations. Citation 96. The results were again positive, but they did not correspond to the expected results, for they gave a value of the velocity of the ether wind at 10 times less than what would be required to be the displacement shown if heliocentrism were true. Now, I added that last part there after I said 10 times less, but that's just me throwing that in there. The question arose for the reason of the discrepancy. In 1892, J. Fitzgerald and Hendrik Lorentz, independently of each other, hypothesized that for the reason of the absence of the displacement in the interference fringe could be contraction of the arms of the interferometer when the substance of the arms moves through the ether. Therefore, there is a deformation of the field of which each each charge, and since the bonds of the substance have an electric character, the atoms will get closer and the width of the body will increase proportionally. Since it was suggested that different substances would probably undergo different relative contractions, and therefore it would be possible to catch the difference of the contraction of two rods made of different materials, steel and pine wood were used, and the testing of the circumstances did not lead to a positive result. It was suggested there. It was suggested, however, that it was the wrong way to carry out the experiments in basements rooms, since the surface layers of the Earth um, might screen the etheric currents, and it would be advisable to raise the interferometer to a freestanding mountain. In 1905, E. Morley and Dayton Clarence Miller continued the experiments at, at Euclidean heights at about 250 meters above sea level. Their results were firmly fixed. The magnitude of the ether wind was 3.5 to 3. Was 3 to 3.5 kilometers a second. Citation at 97. The work was continued by Professor Dayton Miller, who spent about 40 years conducting experiments, completing them in 1925, reporting them to the Washington Academy of Sciences, citation 98. The issue in issuing the corresponding report. And then here we have, it's in Russian, but this is Dayton Miller's um, interference patterns plotted against sidereal time and diurnal time. So diurnal time being like the daily, or the day-to-day temperature fluctuations of seasonal time, and the sidereal time being, what's going on in the sky. And what it shows is that he measured the motion of the sun uh, as to maintain the 15 degrees per hour as it moves to the southern hemisphere. The translational speed has to increase, and he measured that fluctuation. And when it comes back in the north, it it slows down. So on the equinoxes, that's when these measurements reach their minimum and maximum dimensions. So he absolutely measured, you know, the, the ether wind facilitating that translation of motion of the sky. The experiments were conducted at the Mount Wilson Observatory at altitude of 60,000 feet, 1,860 miles. Using a large interferometer, tremendous statistics were collected by Miller and his group, with over 100,000 counts taken in 1925 alone. As a result, it was discovered that the velocity of the ether wind at altitude was about 10 kilometers a second, and that its direction was not orbital but galactic. So yeah, and keep in mind these kilometers per second and stuff. All these are their interpretations of what they would have needed for the orbital speed, um, to confirm the to confirm the heliocentric model. And the only thing that they've ever matched is the sidereal rotation. So whatever fits within the 15 degrees per hour, that whatever translational speed, they could, whatever fits within that. So you know how they say the globe at the equator is spinning 1,000 miles per hour, and from that they can extrapolate a 15 degree per hour relationship roughly to establish day and night cycles. So with that in mind, the scale is that they have only ever measured things at is like a fluctuation within 1,000 miles, or yeah, 1,000 miles a second. Oh, I'm sorry, not a second, an hour. My bad. I was reading the thing. So yeah, it does fluctuate latitude dependent, and the entire heliocentric model and the whole narrative that we're fed about this and interferometry is based on things and measurements in the northern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere data, where there would be discrepancies shown, we don't have any data available for that. Nobody does this stuff in the south. It's all done in the north. Um, so it would be interesting to have experimental data to see if it backs up what would be the symmetrical requirements of the globe, because there's, depending on how the ether vortex works and what path it follows and all that, um, it'll be really interesting to see what's happening at the equator and what's happening in the southern hemispheres, if the speed increases or if it decreases or if it scales symmetrically. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. So taking in, um, so yeah, just don't be confused, or don't worry when you see like 10 kilometers a second orbiting the galactic. Like, nah, that's their interpretation to keep heliocentrism viable. Taking into account the variation of the wind velocity by height, it was concluded that the electric flow was proportionally captured by the Earth, in which consist of today's ideas of gas dynamics about the regularities of the boundary layer and the flow of a balloon in uh, of a balloon the Earth by gas flow. As the result of the works of Miller, who in 1905 and 1907 and 1921 and 1925 put in 1907 or 1905 and 1907 and then 1921 and 1925 a series of experiments with an interferometer inherent inherited inherited by him from Michelson and Morley. It became clear that there is a clear dependence of the velocity of the ether wind at height and on the surface of the Earth. It was shown in 1881 and in 1887 the relative velocity of the ether wind is small at the height of 250 meters above sea level to about 3 kilometers, and at the height of 1,860 meters, it goes to about 8 to 10 kilometers a second. Thus, the relative velocity of the ether wind is increased with altitude. So that's a direct refutation to the globe. The translation of motion is getting stronger when you get closer to the sky, indicating that the translation of motion is coming from the sky. That's and the thing with these interferometers, no relativistic effects are required to explain them. They can be derived without them. So these are first order measurements of a translation of motion from the sky. Now, what would facilitate such a thing, right? And it's the ether, right? So, allegedly. So, let's see. As a result of the work, okay, yeah, here we go. As a result of data processing, Miller found that the direction of the ether wind and the motion of Earth is of a state. As a result of data processing, Miller found that the direction of the etheric wind is as if the Earth is in motion in a stationary ether is moving towards the star constellation Drago at a declination of plus 65 degrees, direct ascension 262 degrees. The probable error in his measurements did not exceed 2 degrees. And Miller's measurements did not exceed 2 degrees. Miller reported his results of the special conference assembled at Mount Wilson Observatory on February 4th and 5th, 1927, citation 100, and published a large review in the article in 1933, citation 101. The results obtained by Miller were in good agreement with the theory of a balloon flowing over a stream of gas. When the flow of the balloon around the stream of gas forms a boundary layer and the layers nearest the body of the surface move together with the body while the distant ones have some intermediate velocity, the starting from the value of the gas velocity corresponds to the velocity in free space. In other words, the boundary layer has a certain kind of thickness determined by the parameters of the gas in the ball. At this at points with the coordinates relative to a central axis of gas flow, and then there's an equation here for that, equals to 109.6 degrees, the boundary layer breaks away. Starting from this coordinate, the gas should be stationary relative to the ball at various distances from it up to the boundary layer that has broken away and past the distances of the ball. Work in a similar direction was carried out by other researchers at the same conference. R.J. Kennedy reported that after Miller published his results in 1926, Kennedy invented and developed another device similar, but processing, in his opinion, extremely high sensitivity, of which amounted to 0.001 interference fringes, although the blurring of the edges interference fringes is 10 to 20%. I don't know what that means. Minus VA, I don't know what that is. The device was packed in a hermetically sealed box, which was filled with helium. By the beginning of the
by the beginning of 1927, the device had debugged and all experiments were already had been performed. Kennedy did not get any results, which he reported to the conference. This interpretation by him was not as unsuitable of his device, which was carefully isolated in a metal box from the penetration of the etheric currents. But as the absence of the ether, but as the absence of the etheric wind in nature, there there were other similar attempts, such as lifting the interferometer on the st- lifting the interferometer on a stratospheric balloon in Brussels in 1926. Here, researchers Picard and Stale also corked the device in a metal box. The results of in this case, were uncertain. Citation 93. In 1929, A. Michelson, together with J. Pease and F. Pearson, repeated the experiment of the detection of the ether wind, citation 102 and 103, this time quite successfully completed at the time of, or at the same height of the Mount Wilson Observatory. They attained a value of 6 kilometers a second. The decrease of the velocity comparison to Miller's data is easily explained by the fact that unlike Miller and Michelson conducted his experiments in a fundamental house, the walls of which were reduced the velocity of the ether flow. Oh yeah, that's right. So they basically had like a free hut situation going on. They had like a free open hut with like a canopy as the roof or something. I got some pictures of it somewhere. I'll see if I can bring them up at the end of the video if I remember. So let's see here. Thus, there is no reason to consider a firmly established the absence of the ether on the basis of the results of the experiment carried out in 1881 and 1887. On the contrary, these works, and especially of those of Miller, speak definitely in favor of the existence of an ether, and certainly of the brief verifications by other authors can rather be attributed to careless preparations of the experiments than to any evidence. It is interesting to note that Miller obtained the direction of the ether wind, which does not coincide with the expected plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. His results reflect not his his results reflect not even so much the motion of the Earth together with the sun and the galaxy in the world of space as the motion of the ether flows inside the galaxy. So yeah, man, the preferred direction is just west to east, and they had this whole thing about which direction they were heading and all this, based on rotation and orbital velocities, and that that didn't exist, and completely contradicted all of that. Between 1929 and 1933, Michelson and his collaborators, Michelson died in 1931, peace be upon him, set up an experiment in a partial vacuum. The speed of light was measured in an iron tube 1,600 meters long and 1 meter in diameter. The pipe located at Mount Wilson. The air was pumped out of the pipe. No effect of the ether wind was detected, which is not surprising since metals have a particularly high dynamic resistance and iron pipes shield the effect. One might as well try to measure the air wind blowing outside with a device placed in a sealed room. It's funny. And dang, that's lethal. In 1958 and 1962, a group of American researchers, C. Towns, of the maser, the inventor of maser, tried to measure the speed of the ether using two masers located on a rotating platform. It was supposed that the ether wind should by the accelerating light change the frequency of the received radiation. The effect was not obtained, in which the author declares the absence of the ether in nature. This experiment contains a gross error. The ether wind could not change
phase of a signal, but not its frequency, since the Doppler effect of mutual stationary sources and oscillations, masers and receivers' interference pictures is always fundamentally equal to zero. In citation 93, the listed experiments are described, and the question is raised about the necessity of returning to the problem of the existence of the ether wind in nature. At present, a number of researchers are proactively carrying out work on studying the ether wind. These works are carried out using first order effects. The effect is proportional to the degree of the ratio of the ether wind speed to the speed of light, measuring the phase of the signal in the radio band and measuring the deviation of a laser beam from its average position. The result of these works confirmed the presence of the ether wind even on Earth's surface, but they have not yet shaken the supporters of relativity theory. Fact. In 1998 and 2002, in Charkov at the Institute of Radiophysics and Electronics in the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, the group of Yuri M. Galev performed a large range of studies of influence of meteorological conditions on the propagations of radio waves of the 8 millimeter range in the base of 13 kilometers, or at a base of 13 kilometers. So they were 13 kilometers high. Daily, the annual variations were revealed. Processing the results showed at almost correlation with, or at almost complete correlation. Processing of the results showed an almost complete correlation with Miller's 1925 results. Citation 104. Thus, there are no grounds to consider the absence of the ether wind allegedly confirmed or experimentally. On the contrary, the conducted experiments clearly show the ether wind exists and it increases with the height, and that it has a galactic, not orbital detection. So, yeah, this translation of motion speed that they're detecting, down at the Earth, that they've interpreted as a translation of motion that fits the sidereal rotation of 15 degrees per hour. When it gets higher, it increases in speed. So they're thinking like, oh yeah, it's detecting, the orbit of the galaxy or whatever. Like, no. Sorry, dude. Not at all. All right, let's see here. Oh yeah, I wanted to highlight the rest of that. All right. It is. Oops. It is. It means that the work on the ether must continue practically with experiments in mountaintops and in space using satellites. Well, funny you mentioned that, buddy, because they did indeed do that, in so-called space, and they found the same thing, the ether wind, the all satellites and GPS connect. In 2004, Wang showed that GPS, the delay in the signal propagation is proportional to the velocity of the observer. The speed of light is dependent on the velocity of the observer. That has a profound implication on relativity theory, and by profound, I mean it completely obliterates it, because the postulates upon which the theory is formed are not true in nature, and postulates are just ingenious conjectures, as my boy Atsukovsky pointed out earlier. Let's see here. And the atomic clocks in the so-called satellites that are orbiting account for the Sagnac effect as well. The corrections made to keep the clocks in sync are just Sagnac corrections. And these are all first order corrections, first order measurements, etc. So What will ether wind measurements give for science at practice? For example, science will give the possibility uh, for science they will give the possibility for so much more complete ideas about the processing occurring the near edge of space in the solar system, in the galaxy, and finally the structure of the universe as a whole. For practical purposes, the systemic study of the ether wind in near Earth to make the more distant space. For practical purposes, the systematic study of the ether wind in near Earth in more distant space will make it possible to timely detect and take into account the influence of cosmic factors on processes occurring on the Earth. Since, since all processes, without exception, are inertial, one can eventually learn to predict the future of Earth's processes and the state of the ether parameters, its density, viscosity, temperature changes, and the direction and speed of the ether flows near Earth space. This in turn will significantly reduce the negative consequences of space influence on Earth and possibly prevent or completely avoid them. All right, so conclusion here. Conclusion 1. The concept of ether accompanies the development of natural science and the develop and ancient times to represent the present. The picture of the world and various physical theories developed by different authors until the beginning of the 20th century correctly assumed the existence of the ether in nature in a world medium. The ether, which is the basis of the structure of matter in the category in the carrier of energy of physical fields and interactions. 2. Failures of numerous authors of theories, models, and hypotheses of ether were predetermined by the erroneous methodological approach of these authors to the problem of the ether. In accordance with this approach, the properties of the ether were not deduced from the results of generalization of observations of real reality, but were postulated and idealized, which inevitably led to contradictions. However, it is explained first of all by the fact that natural science has not passed the stage of necessary accumulation of facts that there were no gas dynamics and data on elementary particles. Both appeared only in the middle of the 20th century when research on the ether was administratively stopped. 3. The phenomenological approach of physical phenomenon rooted in the 20th century, associated in particular with the introduction of the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics into theoretical physics, led to the rejection of the concept of ether and, as a consequence, to neglect the internal mechanisms of the phenomenon, to neglect the internal motions of matter. Physical phenomena began to be explained as a result of spatial and temporal distortions, as a result of thus some properties of electromagnetic interactions, in particular the quantization of electromagnetic energy, the speed of light, were artificially and unjustifiably extended to all without exception physical interactions, including nuclear and gravitational ones. This approach has set the limit of cognitive abilities. Man, this approach has set the limit of the cognitive capabilities of nature by man. Cognitive capabilities of nature by man. 4. Modern theoretical physics has indirectly introduced the concept of a world medium under the names physical vacuum, quote or end quote, quote unquote, field, a special kind of matter, etc., avoiding the name ether as supposedly discredited, thus showing the inconsistencies in its philosophical basis. 5. The coincidence of the obtained experimental results with the calculated results according to formulas of the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics does not mean the validity of these theories. as similar numerical results can be obtained on completely different bases. For example, the basis of the dependence of gas mechanics arising on the ideas about the existence and nature of the ether processing properties of ordinary ideal gas. So yeah, the phenomenons that are calculative answers to everything, being them second order effects, the temporal distortions in the coordinate system, um, to explain everything doesn't mean that it gives a viable explanation to anything, because it's just a blank slate. If you can, like with the issue with covariance and differential or absolute differential calculus, if you change the initial or boundary conditions, you can get whatever answers you need to. So, got to make these highlights symmetrical or it'll drive me crazy. All right. 6. Experiments in the detection of the ether wind, which gave negative results and were on the basis for the statements about the absence of the ether in nature, were set either methodologically wrong, um, see, from your boy Towns in 1958 and 1962, or instrumentally incorrect by Kennedy in 1925 and 1922, and also Illingsworth 1926, 1927, and Picard and Stale in 1926. The results of these experiments do not provide grounds for the unequivocal conclusion that there's an absence of the ether. This is a direct experiment. Or 7. There is direct experimental evidence indicating a presence of the ether wind at near space. These detections were obtained by Morley in 1901 and 1905, with Miller in 1921 and 1925, and Michelson in 1929. The results of their investigations testify testify not that the fact of the existence of the ether in nature, but also that it's a gas-like structure. At present, a new successful attempt to measure the ether wind may have been made. A highly sensitive first-order device have been created, which would allow us to put the research of the each ether wind to a qualitatively higher level. Yeah. 8. The need for systematic studies of ether wind in near space, in addition to the general cognitive purposes, is also connected to the practical takes. And since the space influence of the Earth passes through the ether surrounding the Earth, taking into account in the inertial of all processes in general, systematic studies in the state of ether parameters of the Earth, density, pressure, viscosity, temperature, velocity, and the direction flows can be used along with already known and other methods to create effective systems of forecasting many terrestrial events and the root cause of which are cosmic influences. This will make it possible to minimize the negative consequences such as influence, including many natural and man-made disasters. All right. So we're approaching chapter 3 here. Or not approaching, we're at chapter 3 here. We're almost at an hour. I'm going to go ahead and call it for the night. I'm going to try and just keep it at an hour a night. It's pretty easy to maintain this pace, pretty comfortable for me. Keeps it fresh. I'm not, I don't want to sound like I'm bored reading it or anything like that. So I'm going to go, and not that I'm bored, but some of the stuff was kind of dense and long at the beginning there, and I wasn't super interested in this, particular parts of it. But yeah, I think keeping it to about an hour per session will be good. And I'll see you guys on the next one.